Okay, we're live, and welcome everyone to Being Patient's Live Talk. And today, this is Nicholas Chan, reporter with Being Patient, and today we'll be speaking with Dave Iverson, author of the new memoir, Winter Stars, An Elderly Mother, an Aging Son, and Life's Final Journey. And we'll be speaking about his experience caring for his mom, Adelaide Iverson, during her journey with dementia, and Dave will also speak a little bit about his own diagnosis of Parkinson's at the age of 56 in 2004, before moving into his childhood home at the age of 59 to take care of Adelaide. And Adelaide passed away in 2017 at the age of 105. So thank you, Dave, so much for joining us today to speak about your new book.
Oh, thank you, Nicholas. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk with you. Thank you for having me.
Dave, I wanted to ask you a little bit just about your mom, Adelaide. Can you tell us a little bit about Adelaide and her life? What kind of mother was she like, and things like that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking. I think the best way to think of my mom is as someone who got up every morning and said, okay, what can I get done today? She was very much a take charge person, and she was always active. She was an extremely bright person, but she was really about action more than anything else. And she graduated from high school and college early, at the top of her class in both. She became a teacher. Then after she married, she raised a family of 3 sons. She was very active in her community, everything from the League of Women Voters and registering voters to tutoring in the county jail to all kinds of activities. She was a passionate sports fan. She was always on the go, and she remained incredibly active until very late in life. I only moved down to take care of her when she was 95. She'd been able to live independently for 13 years after my dad had died. So she was a real pistol. People always used to refer to her as a force of nature, and she was.
And I remember from the book, you just spoke about, she was very involved with the community, right? And in the book, you talk about how, she always needs her New York Times. She always reads her New York Times in
Right.
paper form. That's one of those things. And she loves watching, I believe it's the baseball games at Stanford, right? Or things like that, right?
Yeah. I used to joke, Nicholas, that she only watched 2 television channels, PBS and ESPN. She was a real news junkie, and that's part of why we got along. We had many of the same interests, ranging from news and politics to sports. But she was always active, always engaged. And I think she also had this unique quality of not worrying a great deal about the future. She was someone who, even when my dad died and she adored my father, she kind of knew she'd be okay. She was confident of who she was and what she could continue to do, which is an extraordinary trait. And I also think it was then more challenging for her late in life, when she could no longer do or could be the person she most wanted to be.
Right. And you just said, your mom never really worried about the future. I was wondering, did that pass along to you? Like, is that a trait that you have as well? I mean, especially because that's something that's extremely relevant, for you as her caregiver, right? Worrying about the future is always a thing that's on, I'm sure, was on your mind.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nicholas. I worry, I think, a good deal more than my mom. I think we share a sort of certain self-confidence and have faith in I think we're both people who had faith in what we could accomplish and what we could do in life. But I think I worry about that much more. Some of that does have to do with my experience with my mom. But I think that's one of the really interesting things about caregiving is that for as prevalent as the needs are to care for America's old, as you know, someone turns 65 in this country every 8 seconds. By the time we're done with this half hour or whatever it is of talking, that means what? Another 350 people will have turned 65. So it's right in front of us. And I went through this 10-year caregiving odyssey with my mom. And yet even I can kind of avoid thinking about it, or not. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what do I want my daughter to do, if I get to that point? And so part of my motivation for writing the book, in fact, was to try to have more of a conversation about this, that we need to really, all of us, talk more, think more about not only how we care for America's old, but also supporting and honoring those who provide that care. The extraordinary women caregivers who accompanied me, whose work I don't think is valued and honored properly enough. So I think we desperately need a real conversation in this country about caring for the old, and perhaps particularly about caring for those with dementia.
Right. And I want to get back to that point just in a little bit, because I know, some of, your mom's, the professional caregivers of your mom, like Aileen and Sinai. Am I pronouncing their names correctly?
Yeah, Aileen and Sinai, but yes, they were, I couldn't have made it without the two of them.
I want to get back to that later. But first, before you decided to move in to take care of your mom, you were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Tell us a little bit about that in terms of what were the early symptoms of your Parkinson's, and how did you feel and react when you were ultimately diagnosed with the disease?
Sure. Well, my father was diagnosed in 1971, right after I graduated from college. And, like a lot of people, I didn't even know what the words meant when my mom wrote me a letter and said, your dad's been diagnosed with Parkinson's. I didn't know what that was. I had to look it up. And my dad was among the first who received what is still the gold standard in medication for Parkinson's, carbidopa-levodopa. And he really did quite well on that medication for many years. So I can't say I worried about it a huge amount until about 20 some years later when my older brother was diagnosed. And then you start to think, okay, what's going on here? So I was pretty tuned to being kind of alert to that. And the first thing I remember happening to me was I felt this kind of tingling sensation in my leg. And at first I thought it was my cell phone vibrating, only I'd reach for my phone and my cell phone wasn't vibrating. And then I noticed that when I walked, my left arm wasn't swinging the same as my right. And I remembered that being an early symptom of my dad's. And so I went and saw my primary provider, my internist. And he, spent a lot of time talking with me, examining me. And he said at the end of that discussion, I don't know, you're going to have to see a specialist, a movement disorder specialist. But yeah, I think it's likely that you have Parkinson's. And the official diagnosis, which, as you know, is always based on a clinician's observations. There's no blood test or scan that definitively determines Parkinson's. Only would come a year later. But I think because my dad and my brother had done reasonably well, I felt like, well, I'm going to just do this as well as I can. And the very first thing I actually did was to join my neighborhood gym, not because I knew anything about the value of exercise and Parkinson's, which we now know much more about some 17 years later, but just because I remember feeling like I want to stay in charge of my own body as long as I can. I want to do whatever I can to be strong and hope that the research moves along so that by the time I'm in rougher shape, I'm still pretty fit. Turned out that was a really smart thing to do. Also turned out that I was extremely lucky. Here I am, all these years later, and I'm still doing really, really well, which is just testimony to how extraordinarily varied a condition Parkinson's can be. I'd say, Nicholas, that the thing I worried about the most wasn't so much movement as it was cognition, because I saw by then what had happened to my dad. My dad had passed away well before I was diagnosed, but I knew what his final years were like and how much cognitive decline he experienced. And I also worried about my voice because I'd spent my life in broadcast journalism. And so being able to speak was something that, was near and dear to me. Again, I've been very fortunate in the way in which that's progressed. But I can speak more if you want to about how that also entered into my thinking about caring for my mom, because many people find that to be a bit of a head scratcher about why I would decide to do that, given my own diagnosis a few years before. But the reasons for that we can talk about if we have time.
Sure, no, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, some of it was, I think, what many people with a neurological condition feel, which is you still want to feel like you can do stuff. And my mom was really my first example of what it means to care for someone. She was incredible with my dad, especially during his last years with Parkinson's. She really showed me not just what caregiving, but really what love means. And so I felt like, well, my mom and I are really close. We get along really well. I'm nearby. My life is full. I'm working full time, but I have flexibility. I can do this, which of course was incredibly naive. But it was really this desire to want to do this because I felt I could, because of what my mom had done. But in some ways, I almost felt, I think, Nicholas, like it was part of our family story, and that by living with my mom, I could learn that much more about my dad and his life experience. And so in an odd way, it became kind of aligned. At that very time was also when I was starting to work on the film I made for the PBS Frontline series called My Father, My Brother, and Me. So it was this kind of curious intermingling of personal experience and in some ways professional discipline and family life that came together.
Right. And, on that note, in the book, you mentioned that, looking back, you realized that you actually weren't fully aware of the reasons for why you decided to take on the role as the caregiver for your mom. You weren't fully aware of all the reasons why. But in hindsight, you eventually realize that you needed help as well. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, I felt like I knew exactly why I was doing this. My mom needed help, and I was the guy who could, and that it also coincided with kind of my family's history. But what I mean by that I needed help too, was that while my mom's needs were very evident, she needed someone who could cook for her, who could help her get dressed, who could help her in the bathroom, who could be with her at night and on the weekends when we didn't have care providers there. It was just me, although I would add more help over time. So that was obvious. What I didn't really understand was that I kind of needed some help too. And by that, I mean this. It's just my belief that I think sometimes we're drawn to doing exactly what we want to do and need to do for reasons we don't fully even understand. I just felt like this is what I want to do. It wasn't even, it's one of those moments where you feel like, I know what I've got to do. And you can't necessarily even articulate why, but I know I've got to do this. And what I came to feel in time was that, well, maybe that's not an accident. Maybe I wound up in this position precisely because I needed some assistance. And by that, I mean that caregiving reveals your shortcomings like nobody's business. I think I write in the book that it's like a heat-seeking missile. It seeks out and pierces your vulnerabilities. And mine were uniquely aligned. Well, maybe not uniquely, but they were aligned with what a lot of caregiving demands. I like being in control. I like being in charge. Well, if you're a caregiver, you are so not in charge. You are not in control. It's not about that. I'm someone who likes being right. I like, being on top of things, explaining my point of view, and convincing other people of my point of view, and, being acknowledged that my point of view is right. Well, that's also pretty worthless when it comes to being a caregiver, especially for someone who's cognitively challenged. It took me a long time to understand that it wasn't helpful for me to correct my mom or to say, well, no, Mom, that didn't happen. Or, Mom, I've already told you that. Or, yes, Mom, you did go to church. You just don't remember. It took me a long time to realize that instead, what we're really meant to do, I think anyway, is to be present to that person and try to hear the truth beneath the words. So if my mom were to say something like, I went to law school, which she did, rather than to say, Mom, you didn't go to law school, which is what I said, it might be better to think of that. Well, maybe, Mom, are you saying that you wish you'd gone to law school? Are you saying that would have been kind of a great career? And tell me more about that. That would have been a more helpful response, because the truth is, in another era, my mom could have gone to law school, probably should have gone to law school. She would have made one heck of an attorney or politician. But I think that's the challenge, at least I was slow to come by, and perhaps others who live and care for someone with dementia are too, that we need to see and understand them for who they are now, not who they once were or who we want them to be. So I had a lot of growing up, in a way, to do. And I think it did help me to marginally get a little bit better at some of those things. And that, of course, was also hugely helped by the caregivers who taught me so much of what caregiving, true caregiving, truly demands. So yeah, in the end, I think I was there without getting all squishy and romantic about it or religious about it even. I think I was there for a reason, and I'm grateful for that experience.
Right. And one of the points you made is that, your mom was starting to, experience or live in a different reality, right? That, she had her own set of facts, and that she was living really in, like, she was experiencing world and reality in a different way than you or others would be experiencing, right? And you wish that you had, recognized that earlier, right? That's one of those things.
Exactly. I think that, the old expression is everyone's entitled to their own set of opinions, but not their own set of facts. And I think for people, at least with dementia, that's just not true. They actually are their own set of facts, and they are living those life experiences. And we kind of, I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm not obviously a neuroscientist, but I think we need to hear and understand that, so that if my mom said, as she did to me one day, I was left in the bathroom for hours and hours today by our caregiver. Well, I knew that wasn't right. But what it took me a long time to understand, because I knew what had happened after I talked to the caregiver, is that my mom, our caregiver, had helped her into the bathroom. And then my mom had dozed off. And when our caregiver came back a few minutes later, my mom was asleep, sitting there. And she just let her doze for a while before waking her up. So was she left alone in the bathroom for hours and hours? No. But from her point of view, it probably felt exactly like that. Suddenly she was alert. And she felt like, what happened? I must have been left alone here. We have to work a little harder at that and to be present to that and to respect that rather than correct those statements.
Because correcting is so often, that's like our natural reaction, right? It's just natural for us to, right the wrong, right? But, when you're taking care of someone that you love who's living with dementia, it's a little different, right?
Yeah, exactly. It can be so much more fruitful, I think, and affirming. I believe that caregiving in some ways is about affirmation. It's affirming that you are still someone and I'm going to be here for you. And I think that is incredibly important. And I'm so grateful that I began to understand that better over time and hopefully did better over time at the way in which I heard that and responded to where my mom was.
And Dave, I want to go back to the point that we mentioned in the beginning of this interview is, really it's, the people around you who were really central to the caregiving effort and the caregiving team.
Yeah.
I really wanted to ask you to share some of those people that were so important to you. But before I do, I really want to share this quote with our audience because it made me think a little bit about my own life as well. Even though I don't have any experience myself as a caregiver, but I think it applies to anyone in their own lives. And a quote here: "When unexpected kindness enters your life at a time when you need it most, it washes over your your very being, releasing a wave of gratitude that can carry you through the great swirls of uncertainty that will so often surround you. You begin to realize that you're not entirely alone, not when someone offers the simple but extraordinary act of just being there when it's needed most," unquote. So yeah, Dave, can you reflect a little bit on that, on that quote, and tell us about, those people who offered that, those unexpected kindness during your caregiving journey?
Yeah. Thank you for reading that, Nicholas. Yeah, the caregivers we had were extraordinary. They were all women, all immigrant Americans, all women of color, all women who I think had come to this country with not a lot other than smarts and skill. And in this case, women who understood that caring for the old is kind of part of life and part of life's bargain. They taught me so much from the physicality, because caregiving is very physical. I learned a lot about how to help my mom get dressed, how to help her in the bathroom, how to help her, spoon feed her in a way that would help her. All of that, but so much more. Caregiving often requires you to be at your best. And it's really hard to be at your best. I found it, at least, really hard to be at your best. I would get frustrated. I'd get angry. I'd get short-tempered. They weren't, My mom could be snappish with them and they'd just say, "Okay, Adelaide," and walk right back in the door 10 minutes later with a smile on their face. They were extraordinary. And they also had this deep compassion and respect for others. I remember asking Sanaa, one of our longtime caregivers, once how she did this. How did she approach it? And she said, "Well, I just talked to everyone the way I would talk to someone I love, the way I would talk to my mom." They had such gentleness and they also had such skill. And it also taught me something much more profound about immigration in this country, which I thought I knew a little bit about, and which I had certain, usual San Francisco Bay Area progressive thoughts about. But I didn't really understand what it means to have English be your second or third language. I didn't really understand how sometimes life is different if your skin is brown or your last name is Taufa or Morales or Latu. That they were contending with a lot. And one of the things that I came away from this experience feeling so strongly about Nicholas is how much more we need to do in this country to honor those people, because we do not honor them enough. According to the Brookings Institution in 2019, the average pay for home healthcare workers in this country was $12 an hour. Now, it's more than that in the Bay Area, more than that in most places now. And I could do a lot better than that, but I could do a lot better than that because I was really lucky. My folks had bought a house for very little money in 1950 that by the time I moved in was worth a lot of money. I could borrow against it. I could help pay for that care. It allowed me so much more. Well, elder care shouldn't rely on good luck or good fortune or the kindness of immigrant Americans. We should have a better system than that. And we need to honor those people for all that they provide and the enormous difference that they make in all our lives.
And I'm sure that's why, you say that your mother's professional caregivers, not only deepen your understanding of care, but also it's made you a better journalist too, right? Because it really opened your eyes on, how much immigrants do for us here, us Americans, right?
Absolutely. It now drives me wild when I hear someone say, well, I'm in favor of immigration, but we just need to make sure that people come to this country who are highly skilled. What they mean by that is basically, people who can work in high tech or whatever. And my response is absolutely. We need people who are highly skilled. How about caregivers? That's a highly skilled profession. My mom's skin was perfect, almost until the day she died. That does not happen unless you have extraordinary care. Someone who knows the art of taking care of someone's skin, who knows how to bathe it and wash it and what ointments work, how to turn the person in the right way. All of that takes great skill. Yes, we need skill, especially in a country where someone turns 65 every 8 seconds. But those are the skills we need, and those are the skills that we need to honor.
Right. And Dave, last question here is Winter Stars. Tell us a little bit about that title. What does that mean?
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas. Well, the title comes from a conversation that I had with my mom, at the last Christmas we shared together. And my mom was always, even when she was confined to a hospital bed in the last years of her life, she still wanted to be in motion. She still wanted to be active, and she would sort of kick at her hospital, the guardrails, because she wanted to be in motion. She was always kind of restless. But on this particular night, when I walked in, I knew right away that there was something different about her, that she seemed calm and peaceful. And we just sat there side by side for a while, holding hands. And I said, well, actually, she said to me, you look wonderful. And she said it very clearly, more clearly than what she had been able to do in recent months. And I said, well, you look wonderful too. And we just sat there for a while. And then I said, we're a good pair, Mom. And she said, what a pair. And then she looked at me, Nicholas, and she said, I feel lucky. And I said, well, I feel lucky too. I feel lucky for all you've given me. And then she said it again. She said, I feel lucky. And so I said, well, can you tell me why, Mom? There was a long pause. And then she looked at me with eyes as bright as winter stars. And she said, because there's love all around. And I knew in that moment that, well, my mom would live for many more months and that our time was unfinished, that our journey in a way was now complete. That we'd gone through all of our bouts of anger and frustration, but we had found our truest selves in the end, our truest selves as mother and son. And that being able to be with her had allowed me to be at the bedside of someone I loved and to hear this great and wonderful truth that there really is love all around.
And I'm sure that just, when your mom said, because there's love all around, that just affirmed everything that you've done for her as a caregiver, right? All the, I'm sure there's many hard times that you went through during, that long journey of caregiving. But, when she says that, I'm sure that's so affirming, right, for you to hear that. The simple.
Again, it's that word affirmation, we were affirming each other in a way, I think, Nicholas. And that was a great gift that I will always carry with me. And she wasn't just talking about me. She was talking about Eileen and Sinai and the rest of our family. And that's something we're fortunate enough to all know. And it's part of why I wanted to try to share this story as well.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, Dave. And is there anything else that you'd like to add? And I haven't asked yet, Dave.
Well, thank you. Great questions, Nicholas. The only thing I'd like to say, perhaps in addition, is just that the royalties from the book will go to support three wonderful organizations. The Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, Dance for Parkinson's, which is an extraordinary organization that teaches dance to people with Parkinson's and their care partners all over the world in some 300 cities all around the globe. And the third organization is Avenidas, which is a local elder care support nonprofit based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I hope this story will resonate with others. And I just want people to know that if they buy the book, which I hope they do, that the money from the book will also go to support three wonderful organizations that are working very hard to make life better for those who suffer from the diseases of aging.
Got it. Yeah, and I posted your author website on the comment section of this Facebook Live. So if people want to learn a little bit more about you and your book, they can take a look at that website.
Great.
So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you again, Dave. And for our audience, if you miss any of this live talk, we'll have a recording uploaded to our YouTube channel, as well as a transcript published in our website later on. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter yet, don't forget to do so on our website. So thank you everyone for joining, and thanks Dave once again. Bye.
Thank you.